It all started when Sarah and Jack moved into their new home on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. The house wasn't large, but it was charming. A classic two-story with white siding and blue shutters, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. It came with a spacious backyard, complete with an old oak tree whose sturdy branches stretched wide. Hanging from one of the branches was a weathered wooden swing, swaying slightly in the early spring breeze. The move was meant to be a fresh start for their family. Jack had landed a stable job, and Sarah was thrilled to finally have a quiet place to raise their 5-year-old son, Lucas. Life in the suburbs promised peace, safety, and routine, a sharp contrast to their previous noisy apartment in the city. The first few days passed uneventfully. Sarah busied herself unpacking boxes while Lucas explored the yard. He was a lively kid, full of questions and boundless energy, and he seemed fascinated by the swing. Every morning, he'd tug at Sarah's hand and ask to play outside. "Mommy, the swing feels magical," Lucas said one morning, his wide brown eyes glowing with excitement. Sarah smiled at his innocence. "Maybe it is, sweetie, but don't swing too high, okay?" That first week, Sarah noticed little quirks about the backyard. Despite the warmth of the spring sun, the air near the swing always felt a bit cooler. The birds that chirped endlessly in the front yard seemed to avoid the tree entirely. Still, she shrugged it off. Just her overactive imagination, she told herself. One afternoon, while unpacking kitchenware, Sarah glanced out the window and saw Lucas sitting on the swing, chatting away. His little feet kicked back and forth, and his head tilted as though he were listening intently to someone. "Lucas," she called from the kitchen door. "Who are you talking to?" Lucas turned around, grinning. "Lily," he replied, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. Sarah paused, a dish in her hand. "Who's Lily, honey?" "She's my friend," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "She lives here." Sarah chuckled. "Oh, like an imaginary friend?" Lucas just shrugged, his attention already back on the swing. "She doesn't like being called imaginary." Jack brushed it off when Sarah told him later that evening. "All kids have imaginary friends at some point," he said while setting up the TV. "It's harmless. I used to talk to my stuffed bear when I was a kid." "Yeah, but," Sarah hesitated, "it's just strange. He's so specific about her. He says she's a little girl with a white dress and blonde hair. He even said she's sad because she doesn't have friends." Jack laughed softly. "That's what kids do. They make up stories. Don't overthink it." But Sarah couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't just the specificity. It was the way Lucas had said it, with such conviction. She decided not to press the issue, chalking it up to the stress of moving. A few days later, Sarah finally met one of their neighbors, an elderly woman named Margaret who lived 2 houses down. Margaret was friendly, if a bit reserved, and she seemed eager to share local gossip. "You've moved into the old Taylor house," Margaret said as they stood by the fence. "It's been empty for years. Such a shame. It's a lovely home." Sarah smiled politely. "We feel really lucky to have found it. The backyard's perfect for Lucas." Margaret's gaze shifted to the oak tree, her expression faltering for just a moment. "Yes, the backyard. It's quite something." Noticing the pause, Sarah asked, "Is there something I should know?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "Oh, nothing important. Just that swing's been there for as long as I can remember. The Taylors had a little girl who used to play on it all the time. Sweet kid. What happened to her?" Sarah asked, curiosity piqued. Margaret's eyes darkened. "She went missing. It was a long time ago, before your family's time here. Never found her." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "That's awful." Margaret nodded solemnly. "Yes, it was. But don't let an old woman's stories bother you. The house is lovely, and I'm sure you'll be very happy here." That night, as Sarah stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, she glanced out at the swing. The moonlight illuminated the backyard, and the swing hung motionless under the old oak tree. She told herself it was just an ordinary backyard, nothing more. But when Lucas asked at bedtime if Lily could come inside the house, Sarah couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. "Lily stays outside," she said firmly. "It's bedtime now. No more playing." Lucas nodded but didn't argue, which was unusual for him. As Sarah tucked him in, he whispered. She doesn't like staying outside alone. The next morning, Sarah was sipping her coffee on the back porch when she noticed something odd. The ground beneath the swing was damp, as though someone had been sitting there overnight. But it hadn't rained, and the rest of the yard was dry. Later that afternoon, while Lucas played with his toy trucks in the living room, Sarah ventured out to inspect the swing. It creaked softly as she approached, even though there wasn't a breeze. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and she could have sworn the temperature dropped as she stood beneath the tree. "Okay," she muttered to herself, "you're overthinking this." But as she turned to head back inside, she felt it, a faint tug on the hem of her shirt, as if a small hand had brushed against her. Whipping around, she found nothing but the empty yard and the still swaying swing. That evening, she shared her unease with Jack. "There's something strange about that swing. It feels like someone's watching when I go near it." Jack looked up from his laptop, raising an eyebrow. "You're scaring yourself, Sarah. It's just a swing." Sarah frowned. "Lucas is obsessed with it, and he talks about this Lily like she's real. Kids are imaginative. It's probably just a phase." But Sarah wasn't convinced. And when Lucas casually mentioned the next day that Lily likes the way mommy smells, Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. Something wasn't right, and deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. That's how it began. Innocent moments, odd coincidences, and a child's strange new friend. But as the days passed, Sarah would realize that Lily wasn't just part of Lucas's imagination. The swing wasn't just an old piece of wood hanging from a tree, and their new home wasn't just a house. Something was watching, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences in the backyard continued. Sarah found herself drawn to the swing, though she didn't know why. It wasn't just the cool air beneath the tree or the faint lavender scent that seemed to linger. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. Lucas, meanwhile, spent more and more time outside. Every afternoon, he would rush out the door and head straight to the swing, chatting animatedly with his friend. Sarah tried to ignore it, but the gnawing feeling that something was off wouldn't leave her. It wasn't until one particular morning that she decided to take action. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as she stood with her coffee mug, staring at the swing. It hung perfectly still, and yet, she felt as though it were waiting for something, or someone. That day, Sarah took Lucas to the park, hoping to give him a break from the backyard. While Lucas played on the jungle gym, Sarah approached a group of parents sitting on a bench nearby. She struck up a casual conversation, eventually steering it toward the neighborhood. "So, how long have you all lived here?" she asked, keeping her tone light. One of the moms, a woman named Ellen, smiled. "Oh, I've been here for 10 years. My kids have grown up here." Another parent, a man named Greg, chimed in. "Same here. It's a quiet area. Good place for families." Sarah nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Do you know anything about the house on Sycamore Lane? We just moved in a few weeks ago." Ellen's smile faltered. "The Taylor house?" "Yeah, that's the one." Greg glanced at Ellen, and an awkward silence fell over the group. Finally, Ellen spoke. "It's a lovely home, but I don't know much about it, to be honest." Greg, however, leaned forward. "The house has a bit of a history," he said, lowering his voice. "You know about the little girl, right?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "What little girl?" Greg hesitated, glancing at the other parents. "The Taylors had a daughter, Lily. She disappeared years ago, back in the 90s. They say she was playing in the backyard one day, and then she was just gone." Ellen shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a story, Sarah. Don't read too much into it." But Greg wasn't finished. "There's more to it than that," he said. "People say the Taylors moved because they couldn't stand being in that house anymore. They claimed they could hear Lily's voice, see her out of the corner of their eye. And that swing," he trailed off, shaking his head. "What about the swing?" Sarah pressed. Greg shrugged. "They say it moves on its own, like someone's still sitting on it." That evening, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had said. She tried to focus on cooking dinner, but her mind kept drifting back to the swing, to Lucas's stories about Lily. After dinner, when Lucas was tucked into bed, Sarah decided to do some digging. She pulled out her laptop and started searching for information about the Taylors. It didn't take long to find an old newspaper article about Lily's disappearance. The article included a photo of the girl, blonde hair, wide eyes, and a white dress. Sarah's chest tightened. It was exactly how Lucas had described her. The article stated that Lily had been playing in the backyard when she disappeared. Despite an extensive search, no trace of her was ever found. As Sarah read further, her unease grew. The article mentioned rumors that the Taylors had left town under strange circumstances. Neighbors reported hearing voices late at night, seeing lights flicker in the backyard, and feeling an inexplicable chill near the swing. Sarah closed the laptop, her hands trembling. It was all too much. She tried to tell herself it was just an urban legend, a ghost story blown out of proportion, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront Lucas. She found him sitting on the floor of his room, playing with his toy cars. "Hey, buddy," she said, sitting down beside him. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas looked up, his eyes bright and curious. "What's up, Mommy?" "About Lily. What does she talk to you about?" Lucas tilted his head, as if the question surprised him. "She tells me about her doll. She says she misses it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Her doll?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah. She says it's buried under the tree." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Under the swing?" "Uh-huh," Lucas said, returning his attention to his cars. "She says she wants it back." That afternoon, while Lucas napped, Sarah grabbed a small garden shovel and headed out to the backyard. She felt ridiculous, digging under the swing based on the ramblings of a 5-year-old. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. The soil beneath the tree was loose, as though it had been disturbed before. Sarah dug cautiously, her heart pounding with each scoop of dirt. After a few minutes, the shovel hit something solid. She dropped to her knees, brushing the dirt away with her hands. It was a small wooden box, old and weathered. Her hands shook as she pried it open. Inside was a porcelain doll, its delicate features eerily intact despite the years it had spent underground. The doll wore a white dress, and its glassy eyes seemed to stare straight through Sarah. She felt a chill run down her spine. Clutching the box, she hurried back inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For a long moment, she just stared at it, unsure of what to do. When Lucas woke up from his nap, he ran into the kitchen and froze when he saw the doll. "You found it!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. Sarah crouched down to his level. "Lucas, how did you know it was there?" "Lily told me," he said simply. Then, as if sensing her unease, he added, "She's happy now." Sarah wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that Lucas had somehow overheard a story about the Taylors and incorporated it into his imagination. But the look in his eyes, so full of innocence and certainty, made her doubt. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the doll, about the swing, about Lily. She thought about what Greg had said, about the Taylors hearing voices and seeing things. And as she stared at the ceiling, she heard it, a soft, faint creak, the sound of the swing moving in the still night air. The creak of the swing persisted, steady and rhythmic, like a slow metronome marking time. Sarah lay frozen in bed, her pulse hammering in her ears. It was late, too late for the wind to be playing tricks. The air outside had been completely still when she checked before bed. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed, grabbed her phone, and tiptoed to the window. The backyard was bathed in silvery moonlight, casting eerie shadows from the trees. The swing moved back and forth in deliberate, measured arcs. But there was no breeze, no sign of what or who was pushing it. Sarah stared, heart racing, trying to convince herself it was some logical anomaly. Perhaps the swing was loose, or maybe a stray animal had nudged it. She squinted into the darkness, her breath catching in her throat. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure sitting on the swing, a faint outline of a child, just barely visible in the moonlight. "No," she whispered, stepping back from the window. The swing slowed, creaking softly, before coming to a complete stop. The next morning, Sarah awoke with a sense of foreboding. Lucas was already in the backyard, sitting cross-legged near the swing. He had the porcelain doll in his lap, cradling it gently as if it were alive. Sarah felt a pang of unease watching him. She hadn't told him to stay away from the doll, but now she wished she had. "Lucas," she called out, stepping onto the porch. "Come inside, sweetheart." Lucas looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Lily likes it when I play out here." "Lucas, please," she said, her voice more insistent. "Come inside." With a reluctant sigh, Lucas stood and trudged toward the house, the doll still clutched tightly in his hands. Sarah met him at the door, gently taking the doll from him. "Why don't you go play in your room for a bit?" she suggested. "Okay," Lucas said, but not before giving the doll one last, lingering glance. Once Lucas was out of sight, Sarah placed the doll on the kitchen counter and stared at it. Its painted face was unnervingly perfect, its eyes glassy and vacant. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. Determined to get some answers, Sarah drove to the local library that afternoon. She pored over old records, newspaper clippings, and archives, searching for any information about the Taylors or their missing daughter. Finally, she found an article buried in the back pages of a local news archive. The headline read, "Local girl, age 6, vanishes without a trace." The accompanying photo was a black and white image of Lily sitting on the very same swing in Sarah's backyard. Her blonde hair was tied in pigtails, and she wore a white dress identical to the one on the doll. The article detailed Lily's disappearance. She had been playing in the backyard while her mother was inside preparing dinner. When her mother came out to call her, Lily was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence to suggest where she might have gone. The only clue was a single shoe found near the base of the tree. Sarah's fingers trembled as she read further. The article mentioned strange occurrences reported by the Taylors after Lily's disappearance. Objects moving on their own, voices in the night, and an overwhelming sense that they were being watched. The family eventually moved away, unable to cope with the constant reminders of their loss. That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the article. The image of Lily on the swing haunted her, and the doll's eerie resemblance to the girl made her skin crawl. She decided she needed to get rid of it. While Lucas was asleep, Sarah took the doll and placed it in a shoebox. She taped the box shut, wrapped it in an old grocery bag, and drove to the nearest dumpster. The act felt cathartic, like she was finally putting an end to the unease that had been gnawing at her. When she returned home, the backyard was silent. The swing hung motionless, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of relief. The next morning, Lucas was inconsolable. "Where's Lily's doll?" he demanded, tears streaming down his face. "Lucas, I had to get rid of it," Sarah said gently. "It was old and dirty. I'll buy you a new one." "No," Lucas screamed. "She wants her doll. She's mad at you." Sarah froze. "What do you mean, Lucas?" "She told me," he sobbed. "She's mad at you for taking it away." Sarah knelt in front of him, her hands on his shoulders. "Lucas, listen to me. Lily isn't real. She's just a story, okay? There's nothing to be afraid of." But Lucas shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he whispered. "She's coming." That night, Sarah was awoken by a noise. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound that grew louder and more insistent. Her heart sank as she realized it was the swing. She grabbed her phone and tiptoed to the window, dreading what she might see. The swing was moving again, but this time, it wasn't empty. A small figure sat on it, swaying back and forth in the moonlight. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the white dress and blonde pigtails. It was Lily. The girl turned her head slowly, as if sensing Sarah's gaze. For a split second, their eyes met. Sarah stumbled back, dropping her phone. When she looked out the window again, the swing was empty. By morning, Sarah had made up her mind. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag for Lucas and called her sister, explaining that they needed to stay with her for a while. She didn't mention Lily or the swing. She wasn't sure her sister would believe her. As Sarah loaded the bags into her car, she noticed something on the porch. It was the shoebox she had thrown away, the tape still intact. Her blood ran cold. She opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was the porcelain doll, its glassy eyes staring up at her. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the shoebox. It was impossible. She had driven miles away to get rid of the doll, dumped it into a locked dumpster. Yet here it was, pristine and untouched, sitting on her porch like it had never left. Her first instinct was to grab it and hurl it into the trash bin, but something about the doll made her hesitate. Its glassy eyes seemed almost alive, filled with a faint flicker of accusation. She felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, as if she had done something terribly wrong. "Mommy!" The small voice made her jump. She turned to see Lucas standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you up so early, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lucas pointed at the box. "Lily wants her doll back." Sarah's breath hitched. "Lucas, how do you know about the doll? Did you bring this back?" Lucas shook his head, his expression somber. "She told me. She said she's waiting." The day passed in a haze of unease. Sarah decided to delay their trip to her sister's house, partly because she couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't solve anything. She spent the afternoon doing research, diving deeper into local legends and old newspaper archives online. She found scattered mentions of Lily's doll across various forums and blogs. Some people claimed to have seen the doll in antique stores or flea markets before it mysteriously disappeared. Others recounted chilling tales of strange occurrences tied to the doll. Inexplicable noises, objects moving on their own, and children talking to empty spaces. One story stood out. A woman wrote about finding the doll in her grandmother's attic. Shortly after bringing it into her home, she began hearing a child's laughter at night and finding the doll in different places than where she had left it. She tried to get rid of it multiple times, but it always came back. The woman eventually returned the doll to her grandmother's house, where it stayed until Sarah's purchase. The final sentence sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The doll doesn't just want to be owned. It wants to belong. That evening, Sarah decided to confront the doll head-on. She waited until Lucas was asleep and then placed the doll on the kitchen table. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes every creak sound amplified. "All right," Sarah said aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "If you're real, if there's something you want, just show me." For a moment, nothing happened. The doll sat motionless, its painted lips frozen in a faint smile. Sarah felt a surge of relief, thinking she might be losing her mind. But then, the air around her seemed to change. It grew heavier, colder, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The overhead light flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. A faint sound, like the distant laughter of a child, echoed through the house. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the table as the laughter grew louder, clearer. "Lily," she whispered. The doll tipped forward, its porcelain head thudding softly against the table. Sarah jumped back, stifling a scream. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The next few hours were a blur. Sarah locked the doll in a cabinet and paced the house, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer, but she also couldn't leave without figuring out what the doll, or Lily, wanted. Every time she thought about leaving, the image of the shoebox reappearing on her porch stopped her. What if the doll followed them? What if it brought something worse with it? Around midnight, Sarah was jolted from her thoughts by the sound of Lucas crying. She rushed to his room and found him sitting upright in bed, his face pale and tear-streaked. "She's here," he whispered. "Who's here, Lucas?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily," he said, pointing to the corner of the room. Sarah turned slowly. The corner was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier. She couldn't see anything, but she felt it. An overwhelming presence, watching, waiting. "It's okay," Sarah said, scooping Lucas into her arms. "Let's go to the living room, all right?" As they left the room, Sarah glanced back one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the faint outline of a small figure in the corner, but when she blinked, it was gone. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. She wasn't going to run anymore. She was going to end this, whatever this was. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let the doll, or whatever was connected to it, continue to haunt her and Lucas. She retrieved the doll from the cabinet and placed it in the center of the living room. Taking a deep breath, she spoke firmly. "Lily, if you're here, I want to help you, but you need to tell me what you want." The house remained silent. Sarah felt foolish talking to an inanimate object, but she pressed on. You don't belong here, Lily. You need to move on. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the overhead light flickered again. Sarah felt a gust of cold air sweep past her, ruffling her hair. The doll's head turned slightly, its glassy eyes now staring directly at her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. Find me. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Lily's whispered words, find me, played on a loop in her head. What did it mean? Find her where? The phrase felt like a riddle she had to solve, as if it were the key to ending whatever curse or presence had attached itself to the doll and her family. With Lucas at her sister's house for the day, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the doll. Its painted smile now seemed more sinister than ever. It was no longer just an object to her. It was a conduit, a bridge to something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. She opened her laptop and began piecing together what little she knew. The doll had originated from a local antique store, passed between owners who all experienced something unnerving. Each of them had tried to rid themselves of it, yet the doll always found its way back. And now, it had come to Sarah. She decided to start with the antique store owner. Maybe they could shed some light on the doll's history. The store was dimly lit, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. It was the kind of place where every item seemed to have a story, whispered from the past. Sarah approached the counter, where an older woman with round glasses and a kind smile greeted her. Back again so soon? The woman asked, clearly recognizing Sarah. Looking for something special? Sarah hesitated. She pulled up a picture of the doll on her phone, taken that morning. I actually bought this from you a few weeks ago. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about it. The woman's face immediately fell, her smile vanishing. Oh, that doll, she muttered, glancing uneasily at the picture. I should have warned you when you bought it. I didn't want to scare you off. Warn me about what? Sarah pressed. The woman sighed, motioning for Sarah to sit at a small table in the corner of the store. That doll has a history, she began, her voice low. It was donated here years ago, along with a box of other toys. The man who brought it in said it had belonged to his sister, Lily. She died when she was 7. Sarah's stomach turned. How did she die? The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. It was an accident, at least, that's what the papers said. She drowned in a nearby creek while playing alone. Her brother was supposed to be watching her, but he got distracted. He's carried the guilt ever since. That's why he donated the doll. It reminded him too much of her. Sarah felt a chill creep down her spine. And the strange occurrences? The voices? The feeling of being watched? The woman nodded solemnly. You're not the first to experience those things. The doll seems attached to her, like she's using it to reach out, to make sure she's not forgotten. Do you know where the creek is? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman gave her a long, searching look before nodding. It's a couple miles from here, near the Old Briar Hollow Trail. But be careful, dear. If Lily wants you to find her, it might not be just about closure. The drive to Briar Hollow was tense. The road wound through dense woods, the tall trees casting long shadows across the pavement. Sarah kept glancing at the doll in the passenger seat, half expecting it to move or speak. But it remained still, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. She arrived at the trailhead just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy scent of leaves and damp soil. She hesitated, considering whether she should wait until morning, but something deep inside urged her forward. It was as if Lily was pulling her closer. Clutching a flashlight, Sarah began her trek down the narrow trail. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She followed the woman's directions carefully, her flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the creek. The water was shallow and clear, reflecting the pale light of the moon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she spotted something on the far bank, a small, weathered cross, half hidden by tall grass. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding. The cross was adorned with faded flowers and a tarnished plaque. Kneeling down, she brushed away the dirt and leaves to reveal the inscription. In loving memory of Lillian Carter, 1993 to 2000. Gone but never forgotten. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. This was it. This was where Lily had died. The air around her seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. Sarah stood, clutching the doll tightly. "Lily," she called out, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I found you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sound of rushing water filled her ears, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. The creek seemed to come alive, its gentle flow transforming into a violent torrent. And then she saw her, a small figure standing in the middle of the creek, her pale dress billowing around her legs. Lily's face was obscured by shadows, but her presence was undeniable. "Lily," Sarah whispered again, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what happened to you." The figure didn't move, but Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Sadness, anger, longing. She realized that Lily wasn't just haunting the doll or the creek. She was trapped, reliving her final moments over and over again. "I don't know how to help you," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking, "but I'll do whatever it takes." The figure began to fade, dissolving into the mist that now hung over the creek. The rushing water quieted, returning to its normal, gentle flow. Sarah was left standing alone, clutching the doll and staring at the empty spot where Lily had stood. As she made her way back to the car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Lily had led her here for a reason, but there was more to uncover, more to understand. And as she placed the doll on the passenger seat and started the engine, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. In the faint reflection of the back seat, a small, shadowy figure sat quietly, her head tilted as if watching Sarah drive.